The rifle was still on the wall when I got back. That's the first thing I looked for. Not my brother's grave, not the condition of the fence line, not whether the well had gone dry. The rifle on the wall above the kitchen door, same place our father hung it when we were boys. Same rusted nail. Same leather thong, dried and cracked to the color of old skin. It was there. I don't know why that mattered so much. The rest of the house was stripped. Somebody'd been through it room by room, not in anger but in a slow, methodical taking. A chair here, a lamp there, the iron pot that used to sit on the left burner. Like the place had been going away piece by piece while I was gone, and nobody thought it was worth telling me about. My brother's letters stopped coming 2 years before armistice. I found out he was dead from a notice tacked to the wall of the post office in Laramie, which is where I came into town with $40 and a duffel bag and a left knee that doesn't straighten all the way anymore. The rifle was still on the wall, so I sat down on the floor because there was no furniture left to sit on, and I looked at it a while. I'm going to tell you about a woman named Calla Fitch. But first I have to tell you what I was when I came back to that country, because otherwise what she did won't make any sense. What she did was unusual. Most people didn't do what she did. I was 38 years old. I'd been gone 4 years. I weighed 154 pounds, which was light for a man my height, and I had a habit I'd picked up in the mud of the Musargon of checking every window I walked past, not paranoid, exactly, just thorough. My hands were steady when I needed them, and when I didn't need them they had a slight tremor that I noticed and other people didn't, which was the way I wanted it. I knew how to do certain things very well. I knew how to maintain a bolt action in the rain. I knew how to estimate distance across open ground. I knew how to sleep in 4-hour intervals and wake up clear. I knew how to look at a man's posture from across a field and read whether he was carrying a weapon. What I didn't know anymore was how to sit at a table with other people and eat a meal slowly. I ate fast. I'd been eating fast for 4 years because there wasn't always time not to, and the habit had settled into me so deep that I'd be finished before the other man had his fork raised, and then I'd sit there with my hands flat on the table, waiting, watching him eat. People don't like being watched while they eat. So I stopped eating with people. The ranch was 312 acres on the east slope of the Laramie Range, running down toward a creek that flooded in spring and went nearly dry in August. My father had built the main house in 1883, when the land was cheap, and a man with a strong back and 2 mules could put up 4 walls and a roof in a season. The barn was newer. My brother and I built it the summer I turned 17, but without maintenance it had gone soft in the corners, the wood rotting from the ground up. The cattle were gone. I don't know who took them. There were 11 head when my brother died, according to the letter a neighbor wrote me when he finally got the news to me in France. 11 head, a working well, and a hay supply that would see the winter through. By the time I got back there was nothing in the pasture but dead grass and a scatter of old manure and the memory of cattle. $40. A house with no furniture. A barn going soft at the corners. A knee that ached when the weather changed, which in Wyoming meant it ached most of the time. And the rifle still on the wall. I slept on the floor the first 3 nights because there wasn't a bed. I used my duffel bag as a pillow and my field coat as a blanket, and I stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind come through the gaps around the windows, and I thought about what exactly I was supposed to do next. I didn't have a good answer. The Fitch Ranch was 2 miles to the north of mine, across a ridge that ran like a spine between the properties. I knew the name. Everybody in that valley knew the name, Fitch land having been there since before my father's time, but I'd never been on the property itself, and I'd never met Calla Fitch because she'd come into the family after I left for the war, marrying the old man's son, Emmett, who I knew only slightly. Emmett Fitch was dead. He died 6 months before I came back, from a fall, a horse, a gully, the kind of accident that happened to men who pushed too hard in bad light, which was apparently the kind of man Emmett had been. That left Calla Fitch alone on 800 acres with 2 hired men, and a debt load that everyone in Laramie seemed to know about and enjoy discussing. I didn't know any of this yet. I'm telling you the order things happened, not the order I learned them. The first time I saw her, she was on the roof. Not the house roof, the barn roof. One of her hired men was on the ground holding a ladder that didn't look like it had any business holding weight, and she was up on the peak replacing shingles, moving with the kind of deliberate care that people use when they know the height is real but won't let themselves think about it. She had on leather gloves and a man's coat, her late husband's, I figured, from the size of it, and her hair was pinned up badly, half of it already loose in the wind. I'd come across the ridge on foot because I had no horse yet, looking for whoever owned the land to the north to introduce myself as the neighbor they were about to have for however long I lasted. The smart thing to do was wait at the gate. But the ladder was leaning wrong, and the hired man was holding it wrong, and I walked through the gate and put my hand on the base of the ladder and looked up. She looked down. "You're Gideon Marsh," she said, not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Tom's brother." "Yes." She went back to the shingle she was nailing. She had a short hammer, the kind for close work, and she drove each nail with 3 strokes, no wasted motion. "I was sorry to hear about Tom," she said, up there on the peak not looking at me. "Thank you." 2 more nails. "You come about the cattle." "What cattle?" She stopped and looked down again. The wind lifted the loose part of her hair and she didn't put her hand up to catch it. "The 11 head that were on your land when Tom died. Somebody moved them." "I assumed you knew." "No." She held my eyes a moment, reading something in my face. Then she went back to the nail. "I have them," she said. "Didn't know where else to put them. Figured you'd come back eventually." 11 head of cattle, waiting. I didn't say anything for a while. "Appreciate that," I finally said. "Don't mention it," she said, and drove the nail flush. She fed me that night. Not because I asked, I didn't, but because when she came down off the roof at dusk and I was still there, having stayed to hold the ladder properly, she looked at me in that assessing way she had and said, "You eaten today?" I had eaten. A tin of sardines I'd bought in Laramie, standing over the kitchen counter of my empty house, alone. I said yes because it was technically true. She said, "Sit down," and turned toward the cookhouse, and it didn't sound like an invitation so much as an instruction, so I sat. The cookhouse was off the main house, separated by a covered walkway, and it had a long table that could seat 10 men during haying. She set 2 places, one at the head and one to its left, and put a cast-iron skillet of cornbread in the center, and a pot of beans on a trivet and 2 tin cups of coffee that had been sitting on the stove long enough to be very strong and slightly burned. I ate slowly. I'd noticed since coming back that I ate fast when I was alone and couldn't seem to stop it, but in front of other people, there was some mechanism that made me careful. Like the eating had to look normal even when the man doing it wasn't. I made myself put the fork down between bites. I looked at the table and not at her mostly. She ate like she did everything, without wasted motion, steady, her eyes moving around the room out of habit, checking things. We didn't talk much. I told her a few things about the state of my property, the barn, the well, and she told me a few things about the valley, who was still here and who had left. There had been a lot of leaving. Families she named that I half remembered, gone to Oregon or Colorado or just gone, no forwarding address, the land absorbed by larger operations or sitting empty with the windows broken out. The valley was contracting. Something was pressing on it from the outside. I didn't know yet that the name of that something was Harlan Dace. Harlan Dace owned the Dace Cattle Company, which was headquartered out of Cheyenne and operated through 3 or 4 layers of managers and foremen and hired men, so that Dace himself was rarely in the valley and rarely visible when he was. He had been buying land, buying it the way a man buys at an auction, quickly and at the price he's decided on beforehand, which is not always what the seller wants. When men didn't sell, other things happened. A fence line moved. A waterway got diverted. A title dispute emerged from paperwork that nobody could quite explain. The man in the feed store in Laramie told me some of this. The man behind the counter at the hardware store told me more. There was something in the way they talked about it, a care, a watching of who was in earshot, that told me the weight of the name in that valley. Dace was not a man most people wanted to discuss in a room that might not be empty. One man told me directly, a rancher named Hoskins who had sold his property the previous spring and was now working on someone else's land for wages, a man in his 50s who had ranched his own ground since he was 20. He stood in the street outside the post office and told me without drama what had happened. The fence line dispute, the paperwork, the offer that kept coming back until the number was still low but the alternatives were lower, and finally the decision to sell. He said it the way a man describes weather, a thing that had happened, a force that couldn't be argued with, the logical outcome of conditions he hadn't created. "You the one working with the Fitch widow," he said. "Helping out," I said. He looked at me for a moment with the careful, neutral expression of a man who had learned to not say certain things. "She's got more sand than anybody in this valley," he said. "I hope it's enough." He walked on. Calla Fitch had not sold. She'd held 800 acres, the house, the water rights to the creek, and a position of stubborn and specific refusal that had made her, in Dace's accounting, a problem. I came to understand that she was specifically a problem because of the water rights. The creek ran through Fitch land, and whoever held the Fitch land held the water. And without the water, the southern third of the valley was not the same proposition for a large cattle operation. She wasn't just one stubborn widow. She was the key piece. She knew this. She didn't talk about it often, but she knew it. It meant the pressure on her was of a different quality than the pressure on a rancher who just had land that Dace wanted. It was the pressure you put on something load-bearing, steady and specific, and without mercy. I learned all of this over the course of several weeks, piecing it together from what Calla told me in small amounts, and what the men in Laramie told me in larger amounts, usually with the implication that I should think carefully about which side of the situation I wanted to be on. I didn't have a side yet. I had a broken-down ranch and 11 head of cattle and a knee that made the mornings hard. But I was starting to understand the country I'd come back to. And I was starting to understand that the country wasn't empty in the way I'd thought it was when I arrived. There were people in it making decisions, large decisions, about land and water and who was going to still be here in 10 years. And those decisions were being made with the assumption that certain people didn't have the will to hold on. I had no opinion yet about Harlan Dace. I had never met the man and wouldn't, as it turned out, but I had a strong opinion about the assumption. I want to tell you about the knee, because it matters later. The Musargan, the last 6 weeks of the war, if you were there, you know. If you weren't, it's hard to put in words that don't come out either too big or too small. The mud was the thing nobody talks about, right? There are words for mud, deep mud, cold mud, mud that pulled at your boots, but those words don't get at the quality of it, the way it was always there, the way it became a kind of medium you lived in rather than something you walked through. Men who were there will know what I mean when I say it had a smell. The mud did, and that smell was not just mud. It was everything that mud had absorbed over 4 years of what we were doing up there. And even now, 30 years later, if I smell certain things, wet iron, certain kinds of rot, I'm back in it briefly before I'm not. I went down in a shell hole in October 1918. The knee twisted wrong when I landed, and then there were 3 days in that hole before they could move us out. And the cold and the wet set something in the joint that the surgeon in the field hospital said would probably loosen up with time and rest. It hadn't fully loosened. It ached when the weather changed. It locked up sometimes in the morning, the first 20 minutes, and I had a way of walking that worked around it that most people didn't notice unless they were watching carefully. I didn't limp exactly. I just moved with a specific economy, each step planned before it was taken, which looked from a distance like deliberateness rather than compensation. Walking in the morning was something I did alone. I'd get up from the cot and put my weight on the floor carefully, testing, and then work through the kitchen and out the back door and around the perimeter of the property. Not because I needed to check it exactly, but because the movement helped, and because the mornings were the worst time and it was better to be moving than still. 20 minutes out, back and forth along the fence line in the gray early light, and then the joint would ease enough to work. The neighbor across my east fence, a man named Prout who'd been there since before my father's time and was now somewhere north of 70, saw me doing it one morning and called across the wire. He said his hip was the same after a fall he'd taken off a roof in 1902. He said it never got better, but you could manage it if you learned its habits. He was the first person in that valley who'd said something to me that felt like it was about a real man, and not about some idea of a returning soldier that they'd gotten from a newspaper or a political speech. We talked across that fence line a few times after. He was not a man who talked much, Prout, which suited me. He'd been through something in his own life. I never found out exactly what that had made him economical with words in the way that people get when they've learned that most words don't add up to much. Calla noticed the knee before Prout mentioned it. She didn't say anything about it for 2 weeks. Then one morning, I'd come over to help put a new sill on her barn, which was rotting the same as mine. She handed me a glass jar without explanation. It had a salve in it, dark and smelling of pine resin, and something else I couldn't identify. Ida runs deer makes it, she said. She's Cheyenne, lives with her son's family up past the ridge. The pine resin draws out the inflammation. Rub it in the night before a hard day. I looked at the jar. You've been watching me walk, I said. Everybody watches you walk, she said. You just don't notice. I used the salve, it helped. Not completely. Nothing was going to fix that joint completely, but enough that the morning lockup shortened from 20 minutes to maybe 5, and the aching in weather eased to something I could carry without thinking about it constantly. I went back to Ida runs deer myself eventually when the jar ran out. That's a different story, but it started with Calla handing me that jar like it was obvious, like of course she'd noticed, and of course she'd done something about it. That's who she was. She noticed things and then she did something about them. Not with ceremony, she didn't make a production of noticing, didn't announce it or wait to be thanked. She just did the next thing that needed doing and moved on. It took me a while to understand that this was its own form of care, maybe the most real form, the kind that doesn't ask you to acknowledge it, that doesn't wait for gratitude, that just quietly goes and gets the jar. November came in hard that year, the first snow in the second week, heavy and wet and bending the fence posts. I was sleeping in the house by then. I'd gotten a cot from a man in Laramie who was clearing out an estate, and I had a small routine. Up before light, check the cattle, work on the barn until the light went, eat whatever I could make from what I had, which wasn't much, sleep. The sleep was the hard part. I don't want to talk at length about what the nights were like because I think most men who came back from that war and are honest about it know what I mean. And for the men who don't know, I'm not sure I can explain it in a way that's useful. There were nights that were just nights, cold, quiet, a man sleeping on a cot in an empty house. And there were other nights. On the other nights, I'd be up at 3 or 4 in the morning, sitting at the kitchen table with my hands flat on the wood, waiting for something to stop that had already stopped, that had actually stopped years ago in France, but that my body apparently hadn't gotten the news about. The sounds were specific. They weren't sounds that were actually in the room. I knew that. I was clear enough on reality to know that. But they were vivid in the way that things in the body are vivid. Physical the way a smell is physical. Something that lands in you before you have time to think about it. I'd sit there until the kitchen got gray with early light, and then I'd get up and make coffee and start the day. I didn't tell anyone about this. I was starting to drink a little more than I should, which I also didn't tell anyone about, though it was harder to hide that one. I kept a bottle on the kitchen counter and I didn't drink during the day. I was careful about that. It was the one line I held, but at night, when the other nights came, I'd take enough to get back to sleep and tell myself that was managing it, that it was temporary, that it would ease off when I'd been home long enough for the body to believe I was actually home. I was managing it the way you manage a fence with too many holes. You get around to each one, but there's always another one opening up somewhere else. There was a man in Laramie, I'll call him Ed, which was in fact his name, who had come back from the same war, 2 years before me because of an injury, and who had not managed it. He worked at the livery stable, and he was functional most of the time, and then sometimes he wasn't. And the whole town knew about it the way towns know about things, which is to say everybody pretended they didn't know while knowing completely. I watched Ed from a careful distance that autumn and I thought, that's the direction things can go. And I thought about it when I took the bottle down from the shelf at night. I thought about it precisely and clearly, the way you think about a hazard when you're moving across uncertain ground. You don't ignore it. You don't pretend it isn't there. You keep it in your eye while you keep moving. Whether I would have found my way out of it on my own, I don't know. I think about that sometimes. Maybe. Maybe the barn helped enough and Prout across the fence line, and the work, maybe those things were enough on their own. I'd like to think so. But I also know that the clearest turning point was what Calla said at the table in her cookhouse, and I don't think I can separate what I found on my own from what she gave me. The first time Harlan Dace's men came to my property, I was out at the far fence line checking the wire, and they came as far as the gate and stopped there. 3 men. Good horses, well-maintained, not working horses but not quite show horses either, the kind of animals you bought to make a point. The man in the middle was heavyset and doing all the talking. I'd been told his name was Forder. He was a foreman of some kind. He said he represented an offer from the Dace Cattle Company for my property. I said I wasn't selling. He said the offer was very fair, and Mr. Dace was prepared to be generous. I said thank you, no. He looked at me for a while with the particular look that men use when they're trying to decide how much of what they're about to say to actually say. Then he said that the valley was changing, and it might be worth my while to think about what kind of future there was for small operations. I said I'd think about it. He said Mr. Dace would be in touch. I said fine. They rode out. I watched them go, and I thought about how the exchange would have felt if I hadn't spent 4 years learning to look at men across open ground and read whether they were carrying a weapon. They were carrying weapons. They all 3 were, which was normal enough in that country. What wasn't normal was the way they held themselves, loose, ready, casual in the way that isn't casual at all. I went back to the fence line. I checked the wire very carefully that afternoon. Calla and I had fallen into a kind of working arrangement, by then that neither of us had formally agreed to. I came over 2 or 3 days a week and put in work on whatever needed doing, fence, barn, equipment, and she fed me dinner, and occasionally had her hired men help with things on my side of the ridge. It wasn't a partnership exactly. It was more like 2 people who were both trying to make broken things work, and had independently noticed that some problems were easier with 2. We talked more as the weeks went on. Not about everything. We were both people who kept certain rooms closed, and we each understood that about the other without discussing it. But she told me things about the valley and her husband and the debt, and I told her things about France and my brother and the cattle I'd lost. She asked me once, straight out, about the drinking. We were at the table after dinner, the coffee in front of us, and she said, "How bad is it?" I didn't insult her by pretending I didn't know what she meant. "Some nights are harder than others," I said. That's not what I asked. I turned the coffee cup in my hands. "Not yet as bad as it's going to get if I don't watch it," I said, which was the most honest thing I could have said, and I didn't know why I said it to her except that she'd asked straight, and it seemed wrong to answer crooked. She nodded. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "My father drank. When it got bad, he would go to the barn and work until his hands were too tired to hold the bottle." She looked at me. "That's not advice. I'm just telling you what he did." I thought about that a lot after. I started going to the barn at night when the nights were bad. Working. Fixing things in the dark with a lantern, sometimes until 2 or 3 in the morning. My hands got better at the work than they'd been since before the war. December. Dace's men moved a fence. It was a fence on the south end of Calla's property, not mine, and they moved it 12 feet onto her land in the night, which doesn't sound like much, but in that country was a particular kind of declaration. She found it in the morning, and I came over an hour later and we walked the line together, and she showed me where the old post holes were and where the new post stood. She was furious in a quiet, contained way, her jaw set, her breathing steady, her eyes moving along the fence line and calculating. I could move it back, I said. They'd move it again. I could wait for them to move it again. She looked at me. There are things that can't be solved with a rifle, Gideon. I know that. But you're thinking about it. I wasn't going to lie to her. I'm thinking about a lot of things, I said. A rifle is one of them. She looked at the fence a long time. I have a lawyer in Cheyenne, she said. I've been corresponding with him for 4 months. He says I have a case on the title dispute they filed in October, a real case. She paused. It takes time. How much time? He doesn't know, 6 months, a year. A lot can happen to 800 acres in a year. I know that too, she said. She looked at me again, and there was something in her eyes that I hadn't seen before, not fear, exactly, but the first edge of it. The acknowledgement that the thing she was fighting was larger than she'd let herself think about. I know that, she said again, quieter. We stood there in the cold for a while, looking at the fence that wasn't where it should be. I'll move it back, I said, just to make them move it again, to make them do the work. She almost smiled. That's petty. Yes. All right, she said. We moved it back. Christmas came and went. I spent it alone, which was fine. I'd spent the last 4 Christmases in conditions that made an empty Wyoming house feel like a luxury. I fixed the kitchen window that had been letting in cold, and I put new hinges on the barn door, and I ate a can of peaches that I'd been saving for no particular reason, and drank 1 glass of whiskey, and went asleep before 10. I thought about my brother some that day. Tom had been a year older than me and had stayed on the ranch while I went to the war, and his death, the horse, the ice on the road, the bad luck of an ordinary February morning, still sat in me in a way I didn't know how to describe. I'd thought about him more since coming back than I had while I was gone. While I was gone, I'd had to be somewhere else in my head, completely elsewhere, and there was no room in that elsewhereness for grief. But back in the empty house, in the quiet, the grief moved around like something that had been waiting for me to be still enough to find me. I didn't drink more than the 1 glass. I thought about it. I put the bottle back on the counter and went to the barn and worked on a piece of harness that needed mending, and by the time I came back inside, I was tired enough to sleep. The new year came in with a storm that lasted 3 days and dropped 4 feet of snow on the valley. I woke the first morning of it to white light coming through the window, the particular quality of light that means snow has fallen, the way it fills the room differently than ordinary morning, and went outside to find the world muffled and reshaped. The fence posts were capped. The cattle had bunched in the corner of the pasture nearest the barn, their backs heavy with snow, their breath making small clouds. I spent the first day digging out water sources and getting the cattle into shelter and checking the roof of the barn for load. The roof was newer and held all right. By nightfall, my arms were tired in a way I hadn't been tired in months, not from work but from the specific work of moving against resistance, snow and cold and animals that don't want to go where you're putting them. The second day, I went across the ridge to Cala's. I didn't ask if she needed help. I just went. Her 2 hired men, Clyde and a younger one named Abel who couldn't have been more than 20 and had a way of working with his head down and saying very little that I respected, were already at it. But the property was twice the size of mine and twice the problem. We worked from before dawn until after dark, and by the end of the second day, I was tired in a clean way that I'd forgotten was possible. The kind of tired that came from spending everything in your body doing something that needed doing. That night she made soup from beef bones and root vegetables that had been cellared since fall, and we sat at the table and ate it slowly. And the cookhouse was warm enough that the cold outside felt like something that belonged to another world. She asked me about the armistice, not the war itself, but the day it ended, what that was like. I thought about it. I'd never been asked that question directly. Most people who asked about the war asked about the fighting, or they asked about France, or they asked some version of a question about whether it was worth it, which I never answered because I didn't know how. This was a different question. Quiet, I said. Quieter than you'd expect. You'd been listening to a certain noise for so long that when it stopped you thought something was wrong. You kept waiting for it to start again. She held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at the table. Emmett came home from the Spanish War changed, she said. He never talked about it. I didn't push. She paused. I don't know if I should have pushed. I don't think pushing would have helped, I said. Not for that. What helps? I thought about the barn, the nights, the lantern, my hands getting better at the work. I thought about Prude across the fence line saying it never gets better, but you can manage it if you learn its habits. I thought about the salve in the jar and Calla on the barn roof and the 11 head of cattle that had been waiting for me. Being useful, I said, feeling like the things you know how to do are worth something to somebody. She looked at me then, and it was a direct look, the way she had. They are, she said. Just that, they are. 2 words said plain with the directness she brought to everything. I put the coffee cup down and looked at it for a while. There was something happening in my chest that I wasn't used to anymore. Something too large for the space it was in, or maybe just large for the first time in a long time, the size it should have always been. I know you know that, she said. I'm just saying it out loud. I looked up at her. She was watching me with a steadiness that was not pity and not tenderness exactly, but something that contained both of those things and was more deliberate than either. The look of a woman who has thought carefully about what she's about to do and has decided to do it. Thank you, I said, which wasn't enough, but it was what I had. She nodded once and went back to her soup. Outside, the storm had eased to a light snow, the kind that falls straight down in the still air. Through the cookhouse window I could see the white shapes of the yard, the barn, the fence posts, everything simplified by the snow into its essential outline. February. Forder came back. This time he came to the house, not stopped at the gate but rode to the front door, which was a different kind of message. I was there when he came. I'd been fixing a window sash on Calla's house inside, and I heard the horse and came out onto the porch. He looked at me with some surprise. Mrs. Fitch, he said, looking past me at where Calla had come to stand in the doorway. Mr. Forder, she said. He recited what was clearly a prepared offer. A number, a timeline, very generous. Mr. Dace understood the hardships of maintaining a property of this size. No shame in taking a fair price and moving on. Calla listened to the whole thing without expression. Then she said, Tell Mr. Dace I'm not interested. Forder looked at her, then he looked at me. I looked back at him. Mr. Marsh, he said, have you thought more about our offer on your property? I have, I said. And? No, I said. He held my eyes a beat longer than necessary, doing that calculation again. Then he nodded and turned his horse and rode out. Calla came to stand beside me on the porch, and we watched him go. He'll be back, she said. Yes. And the next time it won't be an offer. Probably not. She was quiet a moment. I wrote to my lawyer yesterday, told him I need the court date as soon as possible. I nodded. Gideon, she said my name in a way that made me look at her. I want you to know that this is my fight. You don't have to stay in it. I looked at her face. In the winter light it was plain and serious, her hair pulled back, her coat too big, her eyes direct and a little tired. I know, I said, I'm choosing to. She held my eyes a moment. Why? I thought about how to answer that honestly. Because you handed a man you barely knew a jar of pine salve, I said, and because you said 2 words that nobody had said to me in a long time. She looked at me without speaking. The wind moved across the porch. All right, she said finally, soft, and she put her hand on my arm, not a hold, just a touch, a second, her palm and fingers through the coat. Then she went back inside. I stood on the porch a while in the cold and looked at where Forder had gone and felt something in me that was different from what I'd been feeling for 4 years. Not fixed, not resolved, but oriented, like a compass that had been spinning finally settling on a direction. North, 2 miles north, across that ridge. March, they burned the south pasture fence. Not in the night this time, early morning before full light, while the snow was still heavy on the ground. 3 sections of wooden posts and wire burned clean. The frozen ground kept it from spreading, which was probably the point. This was about the message, not the destruction. Calla and I walked the burned line in the gray morning. The posts were black stubs in the snow. The wire had curled and warped in the heat. "All right," she said. Something in her voice was different, a decision being made. She looked at me, and then she looked at the burned fence and she said, "I need you to do something that is not about a rifle." "Tell me." "I need you to go to Cheyenne and be in the room when my lawyer talks to the judge about the court date." She held my eyes. "You're a military man. You've got discharge papers. You know how to stand in a room and make it clear that someone is paying attention." She paused. "I can't leave the ranch right now." "I can't, but I need someone there who understands what the stakes are." I looked at her. "You're asking me to represent you," I said. "I'm asking you to be a witness," she said, "to the fact that there's a real person on this land who intends to stay." I thought about Cheyenne, the train, the lawyer's office, sitting in a room with strangers. "I'll go," I said. "I want to tell you what happened in Cheyenne, but the truth is the mechanics of it, the lawyer, the judge's clerk, the paperwork, aren't the thing I remember most clearly. What I remember is the lawyer's office. It was on the second floor of a building on 17th Street, overlooking the street, and the furniture was the kind of furniture that had been chosen to convey stability and permanence to people who were worried. A heavy desk, a bookcase full of identical volumes in matching bindings. The lawyer himself was a small man named Cowan who wore a very clean suit and spoke precisely, the way people do when they've learned that imprecision costs money. He was good. I could see that. He laid out the case the way you'd lay out tools before a job, in order, each item in its place, the purpose of each one clear. The title dispute had a weak point in Dace's documentation, a date discrepancy in the original filing that Cowan's investigator had found, and the fence violation was straightforward if they could establish that the original line had been moved intentionally rather than through error. The water rights were a separate matter that hinged on a state filing from 1891, which Cowan's office had located in the land records in Denver. I sat across the desk from him and listened and thought about Calla in the valley, in the cookhouse, feeding the hired men, checking the fence line herself on horseback every morning because she didn't trust that Dace's men wouldn't try something again. Cowan asked me several questions about what I'd witnessed on the property. I answered them specifically. He wrote things down with a pen that scratched against the paper, and when I finished he looked up and said, "You have a good memory for detail, Mr. Marsh." "Training," I said. He nodded, understanding what I meant without my having to explain it. The meeting with the judge's clerk was different. Shorter, procedural, a small room in the county courthouse, with a man who seemed to regard the entire process with the patience of someone who had been doing it since before most of the parties involved were born. He asked questions and Cowan answered them, and I sat in a chair against the wall as the witness Calla had sent me to be. A man physically present, paying attention, making it clear by his presence that someone with means and will was standing behind the Fitch claim. The clerk set the court date for April 23rd. Outside on the street, Cowan said he thought we had a real chance. I said I'd pass that along. I took the night train back. It was a night train. I had a window seat and the Wyoming plain was out there in the dark, the snow still on the ground in patches, the sky coming up very slightly with the first edge of dawn as we got close to Laramie. The train car was nearly empty, a couple of men at the far end, a woman with a sleeping child across the aisle, nobody else. The lamp above my seat was turned low. The window was cold against my shoulder when I leaned close to it. I was thinking about the valley. About 800 acres of Fitch land and 312 acres of marshland, and the burned fence, and the creek with the water rights, and the ridge between the properties that had stopped feeling like a boundary and started feeling like something I crossed without thinking. I was thinking about whether I wanted to be here. Not in the way I'd been thinking about it in the first months, whether I could survive here, whether there was any point, whether the bottle in the kitchen was going to win. That thinking was behind me, mostly behind me anyway, enough behind me that I could see it receding rather than threatening to come back. What I was thinking about now was something different, not whether to stay, but how to stay, what shape the staying was going to take. The plane went by in the dark. The train swayed. A long way off I could see the first thin line of gray at the horizon that was dawn coming. I knew what I wanted. I knew, sitting on that train, in a way I hadn't known anything clearly in 4 years. It was a strange feeling, not comfortable exactly, because what I wanted was something I'd have to ask for, and the asking was going to be harder than anything Harlan Dace had thrown at us. But it was clear. It had the quality of something that had been true for a while and was only now becoming available to be thought about directly. I thought about Calla on the barn roof, moving with care, 3 strokes per nail. I thought about her hands on the coffee cup and the direct look. I thought about 2 words said plain. I watched the dawn come up over the plain, and I let it be clear. April. The court date came through. 3 weeks out, Cheyenne. The title dispute and the fence violation, and 2 other claims that the lawyer had assembled into what he called a solid case, which I took to mean he thought we could win. The night after the letter came, I went to Calla's house for dinner, which by then was most nights. Not something we'd formally arranged, but something that had happened by the logic of things, the way water finds the low places. After dinner, I asked her to walk outside with me. She raised an eyebrow. Something the matter? No, I want to ask you something. We went out on the porch. The April night was cold still, but with a softness underneath it, the kind of cold that has spring in it. The stars were very clear. I turned to face her. She was looking at me with that direct look, reading me the way she always did. I want to stay here, I said. On the land in this valley, I want to stay. I know that. I'm not finished, I said. She waited. I've been thinking for 4 months about what I'm doing and what I'm not doing and what I want the rest of my life to look like, I said. I'm not good at a lot of things anymore. Some things I used to be able to do I can't do the way I used to, but I'm useful. I can work. I can hold a thing together when it needs holding. I know how to look at a problem and not flinch from it. I stopped. You know all of that, you've seen it. I have, she said. I'm asking you to let me be here, I said. Not just across the ridge, here with you. I looked at her face. I'm asking plain because I don't know another way to ask. The night was quiet around us. Somewhere down in the valley, a coyote called once and went silent. Calla looked at me for a long time. Her eyes moved across my face with the thoroughness she brought to everything. The same look she'd given the burned fence posts, the same look she'd given the title papers, the same look she'd given the shingle on the barn roof before she drove the nail. You're a difficult man, she said, not unkind, just true. Yes, I said. The nights are hard for you. Yes. And you're going to be contrary about things, and do them your way, even when I think my way is better. Probably, she repeated dry, almost smiling. Then she stepped forward and put both her hands flat against my chest, not embracing me, just placing her palms there, solid, like she was testing whether I was actually present. I could feel the warmth of her hands through the coat. I've been alone on this land for a year and a half, she said, and I've told myself every day of that year and a half that I didn't need anybody and I was managing fine. She looked up at me. I was managing, but I don't think that's the same as fine. Her hands were still on my chest. I put one of mine over them, large and rough and a little unsteady still, my hands, but I put it there. No, I said, it's not the same. She let out a breath that was not quite a sound. Then she leaned her forehead against my chest, just briefly, a second, maybe 2, the way you do when you've been holding something up a long time and you let yourself rest it for just a moment. Then she straightened. Her eyes were clear. All right, she said, stay. The court date was the 23rd of April. We both went to Cheyenne. I don't want to make the legal proceedings sound like a story, because they weren't. They were slow and procedural, and involved a great deal of paper and two lawyers talking at each other, and a judge who looked at everything with the expression of a man who had seen every variety of land dispute in Wyoming, and was not impressed by any of them. But the judge ruled. He ruled on the title dispute and the fence violations and the water rights, and he ruled in Cala's favor on every material count, which her lawyer explained to us meant that Dace could appeal, but that the appeal had limited grounds and would likely fail, and that any further encroachment on Fitch land would constitute contempt. We sat in the lawyer's office after, and he explained all of this, and Cala sat beside me very straight in her chair, and nodded at the things that needed nodding at, and asked the questions that needed asking. On the train back, she sat by the window and looked out at the plain, and didn't say much for a long time. Then she said, "I didn't think it was going to work." "It worked." "I didn't think it was going to," she said again, not dwelling on it. "Just being honest, I thought we were going to lose the land. But we didn't." She turned from the window. She looked at me the way she looked at me sometimes, steadily, taking in a thing she'd decided to trust. "No," she said, "we didn't." May. The grass came back. That sounds like a small thing, but it wasn't. Winter had been hard, and the spring was late, and there was a week in March when you looked at the pasture and thought it wasn't coming back, that the cold and the ice had finally taken it. But May came, and with it the grass, pale green first at the creek edges and then spreading, and by the middle of the month the valley was green in a way that made you understand why people had wanted to hold on to it. We put up a new fence on the south pasture. Proper posts, deep set, wire strung tight. Clyde and Abel did the digging, and I set the posts and Cala ran the wire, and we worked all day in the warm spring sun, not talking much, just working. At the end of the day, I walked the line and pulled at each post to test it. She walked behind me and didn't say anything, but I could feel her watching. "Good fence," she said. "It'll hold," I said. The cattle were in the pasture now, on both sides of the old property line, mine and hers, beginning to mix, the way cattle do when nobody makes a point of separating them. I looked at the cattle and the fence and the green valley running down toward the creek, and I thought about that first night in the empty house with the rifle on the wall, the floor cold under me, thinking about what exactly I was supposed to do next. I hadn't had a good answer then. I had one now. I'll tell you one more thing. That July, on a Sunday, we drove the combined herd down to the lower pasture together on horseback. A real horse by then, a gray gelding I'd bought from a man outside Laramie who was moving to Denver, a solid animal with an easy gait that was kind to the knee. Cala was ahead of me, working the left flank. She rode the way she did everything with economy and purpose, the horse reading her before she asked, the two of them some kind of agreement. She turned in the saddle once and looked back at me, checking where I was, a rancher's habit, checking the count, making sure everything was where it should be. She found me. She held my eyes for a second, just a second, and there was something in her face that wasn't quite a smile, but was all the things that are underneath a smile: recognition and ease, and the particular quiet of a person who has found what they were looking for without having known they were looking. Then she turned back to the cattle. The valley was green below us. The herd moved slow and steady toward the lower pasture, our horses on either flank, the creek shining in the afternoon light, the ridge between the old properties behind us now, and no longer the border it used to be. I rode down into the valley that my brother had left me, that I'd come back to broken and not sure it was worth coming back to, that a woman had held together with law and grit, and a jar of pine salve handed to a near stranger, that we had kept. My knee didn't ache. The cattle moved. The sun was past noon, heading west, and there was a long afternoon in front of us, and work enough in it to use us both up and leave us tired in a clean way at the end of it. I put the horse to a slow canter and caught up with her.